Sade Elhawary. Thank you for coming down here very early this morning. We had to squeeze you in before the 9 o'clock a.m. interview, so this is the 7:30 a.m. interview on Sunday.
Yes.
Very dedicated for your constituents. Actually, your district is this district where we're recording this podcast studio, which is District 57.
Right.
You're running for California Assembly against Efren Martinez.
Yes.
So welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm so glad to be here.
Sure. And we'll just start very informally. I always ask the candidates about their personal history. Your daughter is here this morning.
Yes.
She's your de facto campaign manager, I assume. She was helping you get ready, checking the camera angles. She's probably better than I am.
So funny.
So yeah, go ahead and talk about your family and your background and where you grew up.
Yeah, so I was born and raised here in Los Angeles. I am the daughter of immigrants. My mom is from Guatemala. My dad is from Egypt. I'm Black and Latina, and really, I think for me, being from two different backgrounds, cultures, has always really guided and kind of formed who I am as someone who really believes in solidarity and understands kind of that, you know, even folks from completely different backgrounds, religious backgrounds even, can really still find ways to build bridges in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I saw that on some of your T-shirts. You had Black, Brown, Unity was your slogan, and I'd never really seen that before. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, here in South LA, that's so important, especially with the demographics shifting so much. It's a historically Black community where, you know, during the Great Migration, most of the Black folks who moved here really were segregated and really kept to stay in what's called South Central. So south of Central Avenue is what folks kind of talked about. And so with the demographics shifting to now majority Latino in the district, I think it really matters how we speak to all voters. We speak to everyone. And since we're on the topic, the city council a couple years ago, when they had those leaked recordings and talked about kind of these racist, vile things, and really talked about dismantling Black political power to build up Latino political power, I think that was a big part of the reason why I decided to run, because hearing that was, I think, an aha moment that folks really believe that this is a zero-sum game and not something about how we can really work together to tackle some of the issues that we see in our communities.
Yeah, and it especially goes against basic American ideals and values, which is that we're a melting pot and we're supposed to come together and hold similar beliefs and ideals. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So grew up here. I saw that you went to UCLA for undergrad.
Yes.
And what did you study? And then you went on to Harvard after that.
So at UCLA, I wanted to be an engineer. I really wanted to come kind of out of what, you know, is like a struggle for a lot of our families. And I wanted to make a lot of money. I had this idea that, like, I'm really good at math, I'm good in school, and I can just, engineer is the right, you know, it's like one of three careers, doctor, lawyer, engineer. It was kind of what I thought. And when I got to UCLA, it completely shifted for me. I had been exposed to understanding racism from a different lens. And I think the reason why I say that specifically is because Prop 209 passed in California in, I think, 1996 and completely shifted our university system. And I was part of the class of 2006 where there were less than 100 Black students at UCLA. And being one of 96 students that we recognized that something had to change. Out of 4,500 students in our freshman class, for there to be so few of us, I think, and with 45 of us being student athletes, it meant that we had to do something more to really reach back and bring more students of color into the university by preparing them, doing college outreach and mentorship, really, I think, investing in our community and our future in a way that oftentimes we didn't have. And so I totally shifted. I studied African American studies. I focused on education and ultimately was really like well-rounded in all the things that I did. I was involved in the African Student Union. I was involved in the VIP Scholars, which was the college outreach program. I was in a Latina sorority, Lambda Theta Alpha. So I had done all these cool things, and even in the sorority, it was about, our philanthropy was about giving back to young Latinas and going to the high schools and mentoring them and things like that. And so I loved the work I was doing, and I knew education was my path. And I got a full ride to Harvard, which I was so excited about, so grateful for. And I studied to become a high school history teacher there.
Okay, great. And that was a master's in education at Harvard.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So then you came back to the area.
Yes.
And what have you been up to since?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to be introduced to a program called the Freedom Schools program. It's through the Children's Defense Fund, but it was actually the first program that Community Coalition had sponsored that summer at the Fauché Learning Center, which is not too far from here, which is a summer literacy enrichment program where you actually do 7 days of training in Tennessee, and you learn about how to be a good teacher, or what they call a servant leader intern, in the classroom with 10 students. They learn how to love reading through books that are with Black and Latino authors, with Black and Latino characters, in a way that gets them really excited for young Black and brown kids who oftentimes are not taught that reading is cool, or being smart and being good in school is cool. And the reason why I talk about that program is because my year at Harvard, I think I experienced a lot of imposter syndrome. I didn't think I belonged there. I didn't feel ready. I came right out of undergrad. I had never really been away from home, with the exception of studying abroad in Brazil. But I had classmates with me there, and in Boston, it was a totally new thing that I had never experienced. And I just thought, do I belong here? Am I supposed to be here? Harvard is this prestigious place, and am I cut out for it? And I think all of those things also impacted how I felt about being able to teach from a way that was really as a social justice educator, someone who could really invest in the young people in our communities. And I recognized in a lot of ways that, in Tennessee for that week, I learned so much more about how to really teach our young people and get to them and impact them and inspire them. And that was what kind of shifted my entire trajectory from what I thought was going to be in the classroom to being recruited to Community Coalition as a community organizer, and specifically as a youth organizer for the high schools in South Central. Fremont High School Manual Arts, where my campus is, where we did amazing work to really shift resources, equity, justice for our communities, with the young people really at the forefront of that movement.
Sure. So since we're already on education, we'll go into the issues now, and we'll stick with education, because that was a big part of your platform. You actually have a very extensive platform on your website, which I really appreciate. Like I just said before the interview, a lot of the candidates have very vague things, and you don't really know where they stand on the issues. It's a lot of vagaries, or they just don't have anything about certain issues. So I appreciate that it was easy to go through and see where you stand on everything.
Thanks.
And one of your parts of your platform was strong public schools and youth programs.
Yes.
Obviously, especially in communities like this, the education system is failing the people who we need it to help the most,
right,
because those are the ones who we need to get up to a higher quality of life. So specifically, what kind of changes do we need to make in the education system to bring up the literacy rates, to make sure that kids stay in school in districts like yours?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things. I'll start by just sharing a little bit more about my background on the education side. Mm-hmm. So when we did work with Community Coalition, we brought things like a wellness center into the school and a community garden. I think oftentimes we think of school and education as specifically the academics, the curriculum, but when we are in communities like ours that have been disinvested in for so long, with young people who are often underserved, it means that they're not getting the resources that they need to be successful even beyond the classroom. And that impacts the classroom so much, right? With everything from food insecurity to healthcare issues that are, the disparities that we often see in our communities as well, right? And so I also helped to start a school on the East Coast called the Nelson Mandela School for Social Justice. And one of the things we did there in terms of curriculum was really shifting it on its head. It wasn't about specifically grades and the A, B, C, D, F system. It wasn't about, kind of hitting specific marks on what oftentimes is kind of this very rigid curriculum that makes it sometimes a little bit difficult for teachers. And so we did project-based learning, and we really gave young people an opportunity to learn various competencies through these bigger projects that were in a lot of ways like connected to life, real life, right? These opportunities for them to understand not this kind of abstract, theoretical, but really everyday experiences that would offer them a chance to learn about history through a project, learn about science, math through a project that really connected to something that they really cared about.
Sounds like very integrated learning as opposed to
Exactly.
just page by page through a textbook.
Exactly. And to me, those are the kind of examples, right? I mean, I do think in the education system, we have to pay teachers more. Teachers are so undervalued. It's hard to recruit teachers and attract teachers into the profession, to keep teachers in the profession. And so I think there's more in terms of resources that need to be thought of. We have an amazing proposition in California, Prop 98, that allows schools to have a certain budget. But what it also means is that that's often the ceiling and not the floor. And I think we really need to think about how do we continue to invest in our schools in a way that does make sense. I talked a little bit about the work that we did before. We also brought in a dropout prevention, intervention, and recovery program where we would go to young people's homes and talk to families about what was going on when they weren't showing up to school. We had what we called a linked learning academy, which was really a career academy, a pathway for young people to be able to get certificates that were part of long-term career pathways and not just these trade programs that oftentimes can be dead ends. And that's not to say we don't need also workforce development opportunities for some of the trades, but before in schools in South LA, you only had things like cosmetology. And you only had things that really kept, I think, our communities and our young people from accessing these longer-term career pathways that could really be, and ensure economic mobility for them. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, in terms of our schools, I think recognizing the opportunities for even youth programming beyond the school day. And I think you mentioned it a little bit, but the ways in which we're really thoughtful around after-school programs that can be preventative, that can be more in terms of, yes, tutoring, but also the opportunities that get young people excited, right? Sports are an amazing way to get young folks to really stay on top of their schooling, because they know if I want to play on game day, I have to do well in school. But what are those other opportunities that get young folks really excited to stay and to come to school every day, to build their leadership, to get them really invested? And I think really being thoughtful about those as preventative programs for what oftentimes in our system really becomes part of the school to prison pipeline too. And so I think that's huge as well.
Yeah, and I like the expanding outside of the school day thing. I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I try to keep her as busy as possible. She's in dance all the time and cheer and some other activities, and I would much rather have her doing that than kind of sitting at home immobile and not in those activities. It keeps them going around the clock, and over time, when you add that up over years, it makes a really big impact.
Absolutely.
Okay. Related to education, just in general, California across the state is really failing, and there are concerns of some parents that there are a lot of social issues that are being put into schools. And I'm just referring to things like AB 1955, which talks about not allowing teachers to inform parents if there are gender identity issues, things like that. It's become a very big topic. And people on both sides of the aisle seem to be pushing back a little bit. They want to make sure there's open lines of communication between teachers and parents. And obviously, both of us as parents, if there's something going on with our children, we would like to know.
Yeah.
And I know that there's some legislation talking about not allowing parents to see certain medical records and things like that. And I'm just curious about your take on this, because these are being passed by a mostly Democrat legislature. And I want to see where the balance should be maintained, because obviously in certain situations there are households that have problems and they could be dangerous. So where do you fall on issues like this?
Yeah, I think first, having relationships with teachers and parents is so huge. I think when we inundate our teachers with so much that you have to do to meet certain standards, and we want teachers to be the best teachers they can be, but we often then minimize the importance of the role of families and parents as a part of that. We don't pay teachers to call parents and to check in with them and to see how things are going and to just, you oftentimes hear from a teacher only when things are going not well, right? Only when things are really getting bad with a student. And it's because that's their last resort almost. But in reality, we should be thinking about those relationships with teachers and parents from the very beginning. that's something that we should be paying extra, so a teacher can call your entire classroom, if you're elementary school, right, 30 students maybe, right, and check in with them and introduce yourself and open that line of communication. Checking in when things are going well with your children. Oh my gosh, Michaela did amazing today, and I wanted to share this is what really stood out, and they're improving. I wanted to share that I've noticed how they're doing in this particular math subject and topic that we're learning, right? But we don't have the time for that oftentimes as educators. The expectation is that you do the training, you make sure they have the best grade scores on the test, you make sure you're doing all these things that are also really important, but then it takes away from what it means in terms of building those relationships. I say that partially because for me as a teacher, I remember when I was starting as a student teacher, and my mentor teacher said, you're spending too much time making these phone calls to these parents. It's just not something that you're gonna have the luxury to do, and you need to let it go. And I just felt like, no, like this is the best way that we can actually have that connection. Then you know which parents are gonna be open to a conversation around gender identity. You might say, hey, have you noticed anything about your child at home? Have they been talking to you about anything? You just wanted to check in? Without maybe saying specifically, let me tell you that your child has, decided that they want to be non-binary. It's, hey, how's your child doing? Have you noticed any changes? In class, I've noticed that they are not paying attention, or they're really dazing off. And I'm wondering if there's something that we can, check in with your child about together. And we can work on that together. I had, done a lot of, my mom struggled with mental health when I was younger. She still struggles, but in a different way. And I remember a lot of the decisions I made as a young person I had to make so that I could be okay, because I knew my mom didn't have the capacity to take care of me. And it meant that sometimes I had to go to the doctor on my own. And in California, getting contraception you could do on your own, I think as young as 14, without your parents' consent. And while my mom would have totally been okay with it, I think it was something that was really important for me as a teenager to try to navigate and understand on my own, because I wasn't comfortable with telling my mom yet. And that's not something a teacher would even know about, right? About, if I were sexually active as a young person. But when I got pregnant, I knew that I was gonna break my mom's heart. I knew that I was always the kid that had really good grades, and that she saw me as that kid and not the kid that made a mistake and ended up pregnant at 17. And
so it sounds like just in general, you want to improve like some kind of communication system, keep the channels open as much as possible between teachers and parents, and maybe that involves some kind of new technology, because like you said, teachers have so many students, and to sit there and try to email back and forth, so maybe we should look at some kind of technology solution to this. So let's go then into another issue which is tangential, and you've already touched on a little bit, which is healthcare. A lot of times people can have health problems, the parents, mental health and physical health problems. And I saw on your platform that you believe healthcare should be a human right, so healthcare for all. Go ahead and talk about that, and specifically with this community, why that would be important.
Yeah, so I want to start by talking about mental health, because I think that's a big part of why this is part of my platform. So I think, one, we do need to be thoughtful around how we integrate mental health care into our comprehensive healthcare system, recognizing that, we often don't integrate, right? We really kind of separate the mental health care system from our physical health care system. And while, sometimes those things are disconnected, oftentimes, especially in a society like the one we're in, stress levels and anxiety levels and our mental health overall can really impact our physical health, can really impact the things that we're going through. And so on the first hand, I think just really investing in mental health care access, treatment, and really bridging those. And I think in terms of healthcare for all, really looking at the ways in which we are trying to find a financially feasible path to really providing healthcare for all, to really looking at universal healthcare, and really understanding that, our communities don't need to have, a certain system for seniors, a certain system for children, a certain system for adults, a certain system for people who are sick, who have, previous or prior illnesses, that we're really able to provide a comprehensive healthcare system that really is able to be easier to access, easier for us to pay for, and not have these insurance systems that oftentimes make it even more difficult. And so I think really looking for a financially feasible pathway, which might take some time, which might be a little more incremental, but really looking at that and really thinking about how we can integrate the mental health care piece into it, especially given what we've seen with our unhoused population, with our young people who are struggling with mental health as well as many of us from the pandemic too.
Sure, and I saw that one of your points was making sure that we have fully funded community clinics, so
Absolutely.
Places on the ground here in the district where people can go.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and obviously funding is an issue with our budget shortfall, but it seems like this would be a priority and one of the areas to allocate funding to.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So then let's go into the housing problem, the unhoused population, homelessness. I had never been to this part of downtown LA before, but when I walk around, it's definitely a problem. And I don't know if it's been like this for a while or if it's getting worse. The reports are obviously that homelessness is increasing statewide, and especially in the urban areas here, like in downtown LA and in downtown San Francisco. I don't even like to go to downtown certain parts of San Francisco anymore because there's drugs and homelessness, and you just don't feel safe. So what's the cause of the increase in the homelessness population, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, so I want to start by just sharing that in Los Angeles, and specifically in Los Angeles City, for the first time we've seen homeless numbers go down. With the homeless count, I think it decreased by about 8%. And so I think that something is working, specifically recognizing that Mayor Bass came in, a couple years ago, and with her Inside Safe program and the executive directive, I think she's been able to really make some inroads. But ultimately, knowing by the numbers and the data that it's gone down 8%, versus what we feel every day, it doesn't necessarily match up to what the constituents themselves are seeing, right? I live around the corner from an encampment that started with, I think, a couple people and a tent to now what's almost the entire block.
A lot of people will allege that the statistics are actually underreported, both homelessness and crime. Yeah. So that seems to be maybe what you're saying, that it's maybe not decreasing, it's staying the same or maybe getting worse.
Yeah, I actually would say I do think it might be decreasing. I do. I feel like there are corners, there are spaces where I've seen things change, and I've been in places where I could feel it. But I guess what I'm saying is, when you go from, let's just use just to round out the number, 100,000 people to 92,000 people, you still see 92,000 people. Like, it doesn't feel like a huge change, even if it's even if it's the first time it's gone down in years, right? And that's amazing. Yet we still have folks who are on the street, and we feel that. I think for many of us, it's a visceral, what can I do about it? I wish I could do more. Why isn't the government doing more? And I think that's the issue, is that there's this idea that, are you even doing anything to make a change? And I think there are things that are happening, but it really is difficult. It's everything from the mental health and substance abuse piece, recognizing that we need those wraparound services, recognizing that when we build more housing, that we have to have those services, because then people will end up back on the streets if they don't have that support. It's hard for folks to maintain jobs with mental illness and substance abuse addiction. And so how do we ensure that folks have those, not only the services, but that they're a part of the process when we're building new housing? I also think that for a lot of our folks, it's just not affordable in Los Angeles anymore. It's just not. And so they're working. Many unhoused people are working every day, going to work, coming back home, coming back to their cars, coming back to encampments, coming back to living on their friends' or families' couches, with young children too. I recently heard a statistic that Latina heads of household are actually the highest growing unhoused population. Many of these women are working and can just no longer afford to both feed their children and keep a roof over their heads. And so I think a part of that is recognizing that we do need programs like universal basic income. We do need opportunities to really help our folks afford housing, subsidize housing, but also we need to build more, because the supply is so low, the demand is so high, and that's what's driving up the cost of our housing. And then you have luxury spaces all over downtown LA that are vacant, that are just completely unaffordable to folks who are living right outside on the streets in places like downtown.
Yeah, it seems like there's a big growing disparity. And, you know, as you've alluded to with all the points you just made, it's a multifaceted problem. You can't just target one thing to fix the problem. And we'll try to address the cost of living and what you think is contributing to it. But I want to go back a little bit to the homelessness and the connection to the drug problem.
Yeah.
Because I know that on your platform, you really want to not incarcerate people, especially for drug use problems. So what's the balance between trying to get people off the street and you know, fixing that problem versus there are a lot of people who, when they do become addicted to drugs, they just want to keep doing what they're doing. They're fine with it. You know, in their mind, they don't want any changes. But then it obviously ruins an entire downtown like here. Actually, just on the way, when I was driving in, I heard one of the candidates running for, I think, district attorney or, to replace Gascon. And he was saying we need to go back to a hard middle where we have to give these people the choice. You can either go to state jail or prison because they are committing crimes, or go into an 18-month rehab program. So where do you lie on this spectrum with being firm and making them get off the street, which is probably best for them in the long term, versus social justice? Yeah,
so I think there's a couple things. One is that, you know, when you mandate anyone to do anything that they don't want to do, it doesn't mean that it gets better, right? And so if we incarcerate people just to say that we want them to stop doing drugs, that doesn't stop them from doing drugs, right? There are still drugs in our prison systems, and if anything, they can continue that addiction, and when they finally finish their sentence, they're back on the streets still addicted. I think those folks who need to go to rehabilitation and are ready for rehabilitation, we need to get them into it. And sometimes there's not enough space, there's not enough funding, and we need to do something about that. I think that we do need to be thoughtful. I appreciate the kind of perspective of like that hard middle. We do need to be thoughtful around saying that something needs to happen, and there are opportunities, there are alternatives, and we don't want to incarcerate you, and we don't just want to force you into rehabilitation, but something has to happen. And I think that as I'm saying it, I recognize that, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Does that mean that you just wait until they're ready? Is it, you know, I think while it's a little bit different, recognizing even on the care courts side and thinking about what it means to, force folks into getting care and you know, through conservatorship and recognizing people who are mentally ill who aren't getting the supports that they need. I think all of it is connected in that we do have to push to ensure that folks are getting the services and the supports that they need. And I think we do want people to go into rehab. I don't know that we want to use it as a way to say you go into rehab or you go to jail, but what that alternative is, I think is an important space to figure out that I think we do need to figure out. And in this particular case, I wonder if, you know, if it's not you go to an 18-month program, then what are the steps to getting there? How long do we give you until there is this, you know, kind of ultimatum around what it is that we need from our folks who really aren't ready? And the last thing I'll just say is, you know, a lot of our communities, especially communities of color, mental health is looked at when you need the help as weak, especially for men. And so our folks turn to substances to cope. Oftentimes, that's not the only reason, but it's oftentimes how, and then you try it, you do it once or twice, you do a little bit here and there, and you often become addicted. My cousin just passed away from a fentanyl overdose 3 months ago, and I think it's a really clear example of someone who needed the extra supports, needed that mental health support, needed the therapy, and instead really use this coping mechanism that unfortunately, while, you know, may have been something that he had no idea was fentanyl, was what caused him to pass away. And I think that's what we need to figure out, is how do we provide them with maybe supportive services, supportive mental health services, rather than just pushing them into rehab that they're not ready for and that they'll just, you know, fail out of anyway, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big concerns to taxpayers is that the homelessness problem is costing the state somewhere between $25 and $35 billion a year, and it doesn't seem to be solving anything. It just seems to be getting worse. And so the citizens of California clearly want measurable outcomes if you're going to hand a bunch of money to nonprofit organizations, to try to provide mental health services or needle exchange programs. So I think they're looking for legislators that will go in and really take a fine-tooth comb and figure out what kind of outcomes we need and how do we measure those to make sure that these billions of dollars that are being used, which is increasing the cost of living for everyone, are being spent and actually solving the problem.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think I am learning so much throughout this process, and I've been so grateful. I've been growing a lot, but I think the learning piece for me is important because I recognize that a big part of being a good legislator is recognizing when you create legislation, how is it being implemented? Is it even being implemented? What is the oversight and accountability? And so for me, at least, I would like to spend as much time as I can before just starting to push out new legislation to really recognize and figure out not only what outcomes we need, but what have we done so far? Where are we falling short? How can we really execute and do better with the legislation that already exists to bolster up the areas in which we're not doing well, that we're throwing money at a problem that I think in a lot of ways is making some inroads, but again, it's not inroads that we feel. We still feel like it isn't making a difference. And so how do we continue to ensure that cities like LA do see a decrease in homelessness and urban areas really do see a decrease because we're actually doing the work and we have measurable outcomes that showcase that we are looking at the best solutions, the best practices that we've seen work so far.
And this is what taxpayers want. They obviously the state is shifting right because they feel like the Democrats' programs that they're funding aren't doing the job that they need to be doing.
Right.
And so they want the thoughtful candidates for office this year who won't just vote for something because that's what they've always done in the past. They want the engineer deep down inside of you to come out and to really take a look at the programs and set the benchmarks along the way and then stop the funding if it's not working.
Right.
So it sounds like you're open to this and you're learning along the way.
Yeah. Okay. An example is I spoke to social workers in the county who talked about the impact of a measure that was passed in the last cycle. They talked about the ways in which that some of this legislation completely makes it hard for them to do their jobs. And I think that to me is like, why are we not having the conversations with the folks on the ground who we're paying to make a difference in the lives of these folks who need the mental health services? And I think that sometimes we have really great ideas and we're coming from a good place, but it impacts the outcome in a way that is not what we want to see. And so I think doing all of that and just ensuring that everyone's at the table when we make those decisions too.
Sure. Then let's go back to the issue that you just brought up about housing, and especially in this district, it's unaffordable, and even for the middle class and even upper middle class now throughout a lot of California, it's becoming more difficult to pay your property taxes and food and gas and electricity. And you wrote on your platform that you believe that housing is a human right. So developing non-market housing, subsidized housing, and adaptive reuse zoning, and providing greater incentives for first-time home ownership. Go ahead and talk a little bit about your district and how to solve the housing crisis.
Yeah, so home ownership, I think I'll start by just saying for folks who are really able to own a home, right now it's really, really difficult, but to be able to support our communities with down payment assistance and really, there was, I think it was called the Dream for All program that was at the state level. It was a great idea. It definitely helped many folks, many families, but we gotta expand that on the home ownership side. In terms of tenant protections and being thoughtful around the ways that we continue to ensure that more folks are not pushed onto the streets, that we are not contributing to the housing problem even more while we're trying to fix it by really protecting tenants, really ensuring that we have rent control. I think there is something to be said about mom and pop landlords who are not able to, continue if rent control happens, but I think there's a balance to be figured out there with corporate landlords versus, the mom and pop, but still I think rent control is really important. And then I think the adaptive reuse piece, we're in downtown where people no longer are coming here to work for various reasons, right? We know remote work has changed since the pandemic. We know it's also feels more unsafe with open air drug use, with, folks who are unhoused, who are on the streets, with mentally ill neighbors who are really struggling. And ultimately, I think, how do we look at utilizing those office buildings, those spaces to really shift and provide more housing when we know that ultimately that is a huge problem that we have, is that we don't have housing. And so I think non-market rate housing, being thoughtful around different kinds of bold solutions to housing. So if we are shifting, what does that look like? Is it providing more opportunities for people who are unhoused, or is it just generally affordable opportunities here where we just don't see them very often in LA, and things just continue to get higher and higher? And I think that there is something that we can do even in terms of looking at other bold solutions and innovative solutions around social housing, around congregate housing, and a lot of that is still what I'm learning about, but that I'd love to work closely with the city and the county to be able to do.
Yeah, I think from my experience in talking to a lot of voters, they just want something done in order to increase the housing supply, because obviously with a greater housing supply, then the prices come down and more people can afford it. And rent control is a very contentious issue, because a lot of people will say that when you put rent control in place, it disincentivizes the building of more housing units, which just exacerbates the problem. So I feel like people maybe want a short-term solution along those lines, but that ultimately it's the housing supply that needs to be dealt with. And it sounds like you're looking at both sides of it, and you're an open thinker and open to ideas on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's important.
Going to a point that you just brought up, one of the reasons why people are leaving places like downtown LA, businesses and residences, is because of the crime and the safety problem. And obviously Prop 36 is on the ballot this year, which is to undo Prop 47, which set the limit up to $950. Theft up to $950 of goods is basically a slap on the wrist. And I know that in this district, a lot of people are not happy with George Gascon's policies and being a little bit too lenient on crime. So where do you stand on crime and safety and the balance between incarcerating people and keeping neighborhoods safe?
Yeah, so I think the big piece around your kind of mention earlier around the pendulum the pendulum swing, swinging back to the right a bit is I think it's tough, because we oftentimes see, right, what's on social media that's sensationalized. We see the smash and grabs, and we think crime has gotten so bad and we must, swing the pendulum as far back as we can, because there are just these slaps on the wrist and people think that they can do whatever they want and it's lawless. And I don't think any of that is true. I think while you said earlier that crime statistics, people fear that they are actually underreported, I don't agree with that. I think crime statistics have always been reported the way that they are, and I think homicides are down and violence is down and so much has changed. And I think instead of celebrating the way that we have seen a drop in crime, we then focus in on the areas that are that we can see really easily, and then say, look at how bad things are, look at what the Democrats have done, look at how we need to get rid of someone like the DA who is just not doing enough. And in reality, I think he has done something that is so important in our system, where we incarcerate people at crazy rates in the United States, more than anyone else. In California specifically, we have folks who have been incarcerated for so long because of our 3 strikes laws, because of our, the sentencing laws. We had juvenile offenders in jail for making decisions at the age of 15 for decades, because we didn't have thoughtfulness around how we prosecuted crime back then, because we just wanted law and order. I don't think that we need to swing the pendulum back. I think we need to make sure that in a lot of ways our police officers are not just walking away from instances where crimes are taking place, and that they're actually doing the due diligence and the follow-up. I think sometimes they think it's not worth their time. It's not something that they want to follow through on. And in reality, if folks are committing a crime, they're committing a crime, and we have to do something about that, right? Crime is bad, period. But I think the extent to which we allow folks to get away with it, I think it's not specifically just on the DA side, and I don't think that that's what he's doing. I think that he's being really thoughtful around what it means to incarcerate people versus have other alternatives to incarceration, while also recognizing that we're in a time where people are really struggling, and for folks who are really struggling struggling and, trying to put food on their table and potentially committing crimes related to that, we have to be thoughtful around the balance versus people who are obviously greedy and trying to, take and steal and those kinds of things. And so I think really finding and figuring that balance out is important, and really, yes, prosecuting those crimes. I don't think Gascon is just all out like, we don't care about certain crimes and that we just let it go. I think he's just really trying to help shift a system that was flawed to begin with.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go into another issue that you have on your website, which is protecting immigrants. Obviously, across the country, illegal immigrants, undocumented, is a very hotly contended issue from both sides. You write that you believe it's the responsibility of all branches of our government to do much more to ease the transitions for our immigrant, undocumented communities, to make them feel safe, valued, and significant, and to unlock opportunities. So I just want your general take on the undocumented situation. If you believe that the border needs to be closed, and as well as the policies that are currently being passed in Sacramento, if you agree with paying for the health insurance and allowing the undocumented population become part of effectively California prior to becoming a legal citizen or moving toward that legal citizenship. Where do you stand on these?
Yeah, so I really am someone who feels that we have created a system, an economic system in our country that has impacted other countries, especially we know for folks in Latin America that are really struggling, and they're not the only immigrants, not the only undocumented immigrants, but for the most part recognizing the ways we've made it really difficult for them to be able to survive in their own countries. I think we do have a responsibility to do everything we can when folks come here struggling and need asylum and need supports. And I think that it is important for us to do everything we can to also move toward providing a path to citizenship for all of our folks who are undocumented. And I think in the meantime, it doesn't make sense for us to then ostracize them from our systems while they're figuring out and while we are figuring out their path to citizenship. I think, yes, we recognize that it's really difficult, and especially when, busloads of folks are getting sent here from other states who aren't willing to deal with the problem. But I think ultimately we are the 5th and sometimes the 4th largest economy in the entire world on our own as California. And I think that our folks deserve to have the supports necessary, and that ultimately we need to move toward having as much as possible a path to citizenship so that we can have folks who are continuing to contribute to our society and our community in a way that doesn't have to be oftentimes what we see is under the table or being exploited and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I will agree with the point that you made about the United States taking actions against other countries that do harm them in the form of sanctions. Especially, I've seen the sanctions we put on countries like Venezuela, and it doesn't help them. That's obviously a federal issue, that it needs to be dealt with at the federal level. And I guess the contention of most Californians is that, yes, we would like to help people, but the influx is not sustainable. We don't have the resources and a way to integrate them, to assimilate them into our society. And so it's a very difficult position that California is in, because our legislature is much more lenient on this than other legislatures. Yeah. So like you said, they're sending them to us, they're sending them to New York, they're sending them to Chicago and Illinois. And people are just worried that there might be a breaking point with the rate at which they're coming in. So, but yeah, and this is a very big split between the Democrat and the Republican parties. The Republican parties say, stop everything, zero cares, zero support, mass deportation. And it sounds like you're further on the Democrat side on this, which is do as much as we can to bring them in and get them up and running here in our state, in our country. Yeah, and I think that, you mentioned most Californians believe this, and I don't know that that's true. I don't know, I haven't seen necessarily the statistics, but I do think that ultimately, we recognize that there is some, even some of the connection with our folks who
are being sent here from other places who don't have a place to live. We don't want to continue to exacerbate our housing crisis because of folks who are struggling or folks who are undocumented who are struggling. But I think at the same time, it behooves us to then do something more about it, right? And we know that it's not a state issue to provide a path to citizenship, but I think we can push more and push harder when hopefully Kamala wins in November.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go on to reproductive justice, which was another part of your platform. I know that on your site you had said that your mom was heavily involved in this area. She was on the board of directors of, was it a local, like
Planned
regional
Parenthood,
Planned Parenthood
yeah,
here?
yeah.
Okay, so go ahead and talk about your stance on this, which seems to be pretty consistent with all the Democrats' stance.
Yeah, so I definitely am, just for a woman's right to choose and the right for us to choose what happens with our body in terms of bodily autonomy. I do think that I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I think having the opportunity to choose when I was 17 years old, when I, didn't know what my life path was going to be, but that would have totally, derailed, I think, my opportunities having had a child at that age. I also recognized and was so grateful that from a young age, my mom taught us about sex education through Planned Parenthood, helped us understand the importance of contraception, and even what it meant to be a young there were so many teen pregnancies when I was a young person. And so recognizing that. The last thing I'll say is that my mom was actually involved with a conference called Adelante Mujer Latina. And she, part of that conference came out of the statistic that young Latinas had the highest teen birth rate. Not only just pregnancy, but they were actually having the children. So what conversations around career and college pathways for young Latinas to understand that they had access to, that was really kind of connected to the conversations around sex ed, or the conversations around reproductive rights and things like that.
Got it. Pretty straightforward. We'll go on to the last issue and then we'll kind of wrap up. And this is environmental justice and bold climate action. It seems like you're a very strong proponent of green and renewable technology across the board and phasing out as much as possible gas, oil, things like that. Yeah. So what's your take on where California should stand on green tech regulations? Because there is contention that the rate at which California is pushing it is too fast and that we don't have the infrastructure to electrify everything right away. So just in general, go ahead and talk about this area.
Yeah, so I think, excuse me. So I think that while it might seem that we're moving too fast, right? Climate change is also, right? This climate crisis is moving so quickly. If we don't do something about it soon, it's gonna be worse and worse for our children and grandchildren and future generations, right? So I think that...
And I can tell you're biased because you showed up in a Tesla today.
So funny. It's funny because I bought my car 6 years ago and I'm very embarrassed now about Elon Musk, who just is...
You like his technology, but not his politics.
Right.
That's all right. You can separate the two, right?
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think that we, yes, I think electric vehicles, as an example, are really important and really helpful, and we can move toward electric vehicles. But on the other hand, you're right. Electric vehicle infrastructure in South Los Angeles is horrible. To get supports for charging, I've lived in 5 different places in the South LA kind of vicinity, and it wasn't until this most recent place that I had access to a charger in my apartment building. That's just in my apartment building. If I wanted to do supercharging, it's not very accessible, not very close. In ways that I've experienced in other places, when you might go to a city that has 4 different charging stations just in their 5-mile, kind of small radius. But I partially say that to say, yes, we do need to also move forward with the kind of infrastructure that's needed, and we need to do it at a faster rate if we want to be able to see our, automotive vehicles electrified. I think beyond that, really looking at what does it take to make things just have a faster, more, I don't want to say reliable, but like efficient pathway for things to happen, right? If we're asking folks to, install solar panels, how quickly does that actually happen? And we know it takes a long time sometimes. The permitting might be quick now, but the actual, from beginning to end in terms of the utilities, then turning them on and allowing folks to use it, I think we have to start. The more we push, I think the more we realize the kinks, the more we recognize what we do need to fix. And so I think rather than saying we need to slow down, I think we need to say, well, what do we need to fix in order to reach this goal? And then maybe if we don't reach the goal, we've done everything we can and we can potentially push it out. But I think rather than saying 2035 is too soon, let's push to 2050. I think we say 2035 is a lofty goal. Let's see if we can get there. And if we can't, let's keep doing everything we can in the process to really do what we can to address the climate crisis overall.
Okay. What about the people who would argue that pushing the green tech fast is actually increasing the cost of living? It's raising the energy costs and putting mandates like if you're building a new home and you have to have solar panels, that obviously drives up the cost of buying a new home, buying electrical appliances, yard equipment, like that's all electric when I walk into Home Depot now. And I know that a lot of people who have businesses in that industry are not happy with it, and it makes their jobs more difficult. So do you think if we just push this harder and keep pushing it at the rate we're pushing it, that these costs will come down quickly enough? Because we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis right now.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate you sharing that and breaking that down. I don't think I recognized or had that understanding of kind of green tech pushing the cost of living up. So thank you for sharing that. And I think the extent to which that the goal is or the hope is that it, that as we continue to push that it comes down is helpful.
Yeah,
but
which
I think
is absolutely true. The cost of all this electrical stuff has dropped drastically. The more any technology is pushed, that's the case.
Right. But I think that you're right in the kind of current crisis that we're in around cost of living. I do think that we need to be thoughtful. I don't know that that means we need to slow down, but like what are the opportunities I think for subsidies in this time where we're asking folks to increase green tech, that we also are really helping folks so that it doesn't make it such a burden. And then I think recognizing that we provide those subsidies until costs kind of come down could be helpful. I don't know how, if that could even happen. I think that's something that I would love to explore more, but I think it's really helpful that you broke it down in that way for me because it's something that I didn't know.
Sure, yeah, understand. And I mean, obviously, you haven't been in politics, you're not a career politician, and so a lot of this is new for everybody. And as I alluded to before, all the voters just want thoughtful people that will carefully think about all of the legislation that they're pushing and the rate at which it's being pushed.
Right.
So let's just go ahead and wrap up. I want to give you the opportunity to make the distinction between yourself and Efren, your opponent, and where you guys are a little bit different or where you believe that you can be a more effective leader for your district.
Yeah, so first I want to acknowledge that I didn't say earlier that my daughter is here with me today. I'm a foster mom, and I'm really grateful just for the opportunity to partially, I think, run for office and set an example for her future, but I think for so many young people that I think have the opportunity to see someone that looks like them, to see someone who is really invested in the community to be able to do this long term. I think that's a big distinction between me and my opponent. I have done the work in our community for years, and when I say the work, I don't mean a small business. I don't mean that I've served on commissions and boards to make myself look good. Like, I've been on the ground doing the work, and I think in this case, as a community organizer, youth organizer, I've trained hundreds of folks in our community, mentored them to be organizers or activists, or even beyond that they could take what they've learned about social justice around our community and go into architecture and utilize that grounding in community and go into law and understand the importance of being trained in social justice so that they can apply that when they're doing their legal work, right? And being thoughtful around all the ways that we ultimately need to continue to do this work, continue to expand and build the social justice movement so that we can see the changes that we need. I, at Community Coalition, when I came back the second time, really helped to expand the organization by building a training center for community organizers, which is ultimately a community center as well. We purchased property in the community that was really community-led development, right? Really focused on what the community wanted to see in the space. And I think it's a huge distinction from someone who is bought out by the police unions, someone who is bought out by our big oil companies, by tobacco, by alcohol. I think for us, we recognize that we have an over-concentration of liquor stores in our community. And we know that if we're gonna change that, then we have to actually hold our folks accountable who are in those industries. And even as we think about, the rise in what we've seen and what we want to see changed, especially since the pandemic and folks really viscerally seeing the impact of the murder of George Floyd, that means that we have to hold our police unions accountable and our police accountable to really being thoughtful around the trainings that they have, the opportunities for them to really, not let go of certain things, but really do the work in our communities to help provide that safety. I think for me, it's about community safety. It's about bringing in folks like gang interventionists to help do the work of providing safety in the community, who understand the dynamics, who've been there, who may have had a history, that they can now really help our communities to feel safer. And I think a lot of that requires us to really shift in terms of how we do that kind of work. I think we talked a little bit about the green tech, of the clean energy. I think being bought out by big oil is something that is clearly shows that we have someone who's not willing to invest in our communities, to have cleaner air, cleaner water, and just better spaces that our community needs. And so I think for me, it's really being able to push against someone who's also willing to divide our communities. As someone who's both Black and Latina, I talked a little bit about that earlier. I think you don't have to be Black and Latina to be able to do this work, right? It definitely uniquely positions me, but I think it really showcases when someone's willing to divide our communities, to say, Sade's not really Latina, Sade's not really Black, Sade doesn't really care about our folks. I think I don't need to negatively disparage someone to boost myself up. It's about us really doing the work and pushing to make sure that we are really representing our community in a way that we deserve.
Okay. I appreciate the commitment to being on the ground and connected to your constituents, because that's what they're looking for, and having thoughtful solutions and talking to people who actually know what outcomes need to happen and then finding a path to those outcomes.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming this morning. Sade Elhawary, running for California Assembly, District 57. I wish you the best in this last month of the race.
Yes, one more month. Nice to meet you.